Page 73, the French and Indian War. Now, if we're going to fight a war, there's some things we got to know before we get into the details. First of all, we need to know the name of the war. Well, we just named it, didn't we? The French and Indian War. By the way, this war goes by two different names. Right? In Europe, this same war was called the 7 Years' War. The war is between England, which is also Great Britain. Britain and England, same thing. So it's a war between Britain and France, and it's nothing new. Britain and France had been in and out of war against each other for years and years. This is the fourth in a series of wars between those two countries during a period of years. This one's called, in Europe, they named it the 7 Years' War. Here in the colonies, we called it the French and Indian War. So this war, there were battles that took place in Europe, and there were battles that took place over in the colonies. Same war, just two different names. We call it French and Indian War here. In Europe, they call it the 7 Years' War. So now we know the name of the war. When you're going to learn about a war, you should know what years it took place. All right. First battle took place in 1754. Final battle, 1763. Now, if you're paying attention, the math doesn't add up, does it? That's more than 7 years. Well, there's an explanation for that. Like I said, there were battles that took place on two different continents. The battles between France and Britain that took place in Europe lasted 7 years. So that's why they call it the 7 Years' War. Those battles lasted longer over here. We call it the French and Indian War. Now, if you're going to learn about a war, you should know who's fighting against who. Well, we kind of already told you, didn't we? It's Britain, their army, against France and their army. All right, but over here in the colonies, both sides had help. Helping the French or the Indians. They're going to fight on the side of the French. That should make sense to you, right? Because remember how France made money off the New World by befriending Indians and trading with them. So for the most part, Indians like the French. So it makes sense that they're going to fight on their side. Besides, France was trying to convince the Indians to help them in this war because France was telling the Indians, look, the English colonies keep growing and expanding, and they're just going to take more and more of the Indians' land. Was France lying to the Indians? No, it's pretty much what's going to happen, right? So it does make sense that the Indians would help the French. All right, but over here in the colonies, the battles that took place here, the British Army had some help too. That's us, the American colonists. After all, how many times have we said when we look at this map, what country are we looking at? England. Well, our country's now at war. Some of the battles are here at our place. So we're going to help our own country in a war, right? So the American colonists are going to fight side by side with the British Army. Now, there is no American army, but we did have militias. Remember that word from the test. A militia is just local civilians. They don't have training. They don't have uniforms. They're not really in the military. They just have their own gun, and they help when a situation arises. It's just a local bunch of men who, if something comes up, the local militia guys will grab their gun and they'll keep the peace. And that makes sense. In those days, there could have been some situations, especially with Indians and whatever. So every community had a local militia. The way I like to describe the militia is I just usually call them a bunch of farmers with guns. Again, they don't have formal military training or uniforms, just a bunch of farmers with guns, and they are going to help the British Army in this French and Indian War. So it's the British Army plus the colonial militias against the French Army plus the Indians. French and Indian War. Any questions so far? Now we know the name of the war, when it was, fighting against who, there's still something very important to understanding the war. You need to know what they're fighting about, right? What's the war over? What's all the fuss about? Well, look carefully at your map on page 73. We'll see what they're fighting about. Look at the color code, study that map. What is the blue part of the map?
British.
That's British. That's England. Hey, if you look carefully, that blue part, that's the 13 colonies, isn't it? All right, well, of course, we already know that's British, that's England. All right, what about the green? What's the green?
French.
That's French territory. All right, so I don't have that on my map, but that's west of the Mississippi River. So if on this map, this is about where the map ends, where the Mississippi River would be. So everything over here is France. So France agrees, England agrees, this is France. France agrees, England agrees, this is England. What they don't agree about is that area in between. It's the dark orange part on your map, the disputed territory, right? In other words, west of the Appalachian Mountains, if you look here, right here on my map, it says Appalachian Mountains. I know you can't read it. But west of the mountains, but east of the Mississippi River, this area right here is the disputed territory. On my map, it says French territory, but in parentheses, it says disputed between Great Britain and France. That is what they're fighting over. England says, this is part of England. We're going to expand our colonies westward. France says, no, you can't do that because your colonies end at the mountains. This is France. Well, they can't both be right, can they? So who's right? Well, whoever wins the war, that's who's right. Now we know the name of the war, when it was, who's fighting against who, and what they're fighting about. You ready to get into some of the details? All right, flip over to page 74. Our story starts right here on my map. I put a real red piece of paper here so you can see it. All right, it's a unique place out west where 3 rivers all come together at the same spot. Now that's a big deal because in those days, rivers were the main transportation routes. There's no interstates, there's not very many roads at all. So the best, fastest, most efficient way to travel in colonial days was by river. So rivers are important. Well, you can imagine if 2 rivers come together, that makes an intersection, right? You could go more places. So where 2 rivers come together is really an important spot. Well, you know what's even better than that? Where 3 rivers would come together. Think of all the different places and directions you could go where 3 rivers come together at the same spot. Well, there is such a spot way out west here in what is today western Pennsylvania. And of course, geography hasn't changed. Those 3 rivers still come together at that same spot. Today, that spot is the city of Pittsburgh in western Pennsylvania. 3 rivers all come together there. Now, obviously, it's a big city today, but in the 1750s, it was just a wilderness. It's just a spot where 3 rivers come together, which would be a big deal because of transportation in those days. So now that there's fixing to be a war, the colonists begin constructing a fort right at that spot because they realize if they can control this intersection, well, they can kind of control all 3 rivers. So they start building a fort, and the French army sees them. And they say, great idea, why didn't we think of that? Let's take the fort from them. Wait, let's wait till they do all the work and finish the fort. Then we'll take it from them. And that's what France did. Once the fort was completed, they captured the fort, and now it's under French control, and they renamed it Fort Duquesne. If you look on page 74, you'll see where it says Fort Duquesne. It looks like Fort Duquesne. But it's a French word, so it's pronounced Fort Duquesne. Now it's under the control of which country? France. France has it. Pay attention. France is controlling the fort. Now, the governor of Virginia, way back in Williamsburg, hears about that. He hears that the French took this fort. And he says, well, they can't do that. That's part of England. So he decides to send some of his militia out to tell the French, you gotta go, you're trespassing. You can't have a fort there, this is England. And the young elite, he sends a young militiaman, just 21 years old, pretty young to be a leader of the militia, right? But he's kind of a tall kid, and he shows some good leadership qualities, so he puts him in charge. Who am I talking about?
George Washington.
George Washington. Of course, we know George Washington's legend. He's the father of our country, but at age 21, he's just another farmer with a gun. But the governor recognizes his leadership ability, so he puts him in charge of these Virginia militiamen. Now, Virginia had a cool name for their militia. If you're gonna be a bunch of farmers with guns, you should have a cool name, right? They called themselves the Virginia Rangers. So here's young George Washington and his Virginia Rangers, and he is going to go west. There's not a lot of roads. Gonna leave this colored area on my map, go out into the frontier, the unsettled area. He's gotta cross rivers, mountain range, before he ever gets to Fort Duquesne. So to help show him the way, George Washington travels with some Indians as guides. Takes them a long time, but they finally arrive at Fort Duquesne. They come in peace, there's no war yet. So George Washington goes into the fort and meets with the French commander. George Washington says, hey, look at this, and he gets his map out and lays it out on the table, and he says to the French commander, you see this spot here on the map? See where this river and that river and this river, they all come together at the same spot? French commander's like, yeah, I see. George Washington's like, well, this is where we are. You've seen that on maps, like, you are here, right? He says, this is where we are. French commander goes, you're right, that is where we are. And then George Washington says, well, look what my map says. It says, England, British territory. You're trespassing. Governor of Virginia says you're gonna have to go. You can't stay in this fort since you're from France. French commander says, I see. Well, let me show you something. And he gets out his map and lays it on the table on top of George Washington's map. He says, see, where the three rivers come together, this is where we are. And what my map says, it says French territory. So you go tell your governor, we're not leaving. It's part of our country. Well, now wait a minute, who's right? Well, it depends whose map you go by, right? Same geographic map, just it's labeled differently. But bottom line, France isn't leaving. So George Washington has to go back and tell the governor the bad news. France has no intention of leaving. Well, in the meantime, remember those Indian guides that traveled with George Washington? One of them, while George was in the fort, was taken aside to a back room by the Indians that are helping the French. And they're saying, psst, come here. What are you doing? You're on the wrong side. Us Indians should be helping France. They're our friends. They trade with us. England is taking our lands. Why are you helping them? And they bribed him. And they paid him to assassinate George Washington. So the Indian accepted the bribe. And on the way back to Virginia, the Indian waited till they thought the time was right, positioned his horse behind George Washington's horse, made sure nobody's watching, pulled out his gun, took aim, and fired at George Washington's back, and missed. Alright, then George's boys, they jumped this Indian, they have no more problems with him. Was George Washington lucky?
Yes.
Oh, now wait a minute, what did we learn about earlier in the year? God's providence means God is in control. Alright? I believe, and I think it makes a lot of sense, he wasn't lucky. God's hand of protection was on him, because God is in control. Hey, plan for young George Washington's life. Right? He's still, not only in this war, he's gonna fight in our war for independence. He's gonna be our first president, the father of our country. We're gonna have the Washington Monument, the nation's capital named after him. He's gotta get his picture on the dollar bill and hanging in our history classroom. He can't be dying at age 21 at Fort Duquesne, right? God's got a plan for his life, so he protected him from this assassination attempt. All right, and then they continued on back, and a blizzard hit. And everyone in George Washington's party died except for him and one other guy. And then George Washington fell through some thin ice in the blizzard, submerged in ice cold water. His friend fished him out. Gotta get him warm quick before he turns into a popsicle. George Washington survived that. When he finally got back to Williamsburg and reported to the governor of Virginia, I'm sure the first thing he said is, man, that was a tough trip. The governor's like, where is everybody? Well, they're all dead except me and this other guy. But the bad news is France says they're not leaving. They think they're in France. Well, at that point, the governor sends a message to his boss. Remember, this is England. So who's the governor's boss? The King of England. So he sends a message over to the King of England and tells him, you know, France, that you're always at war with? I'm sure you're at war with them now and over in Europe. Well, guess what? They have a fort over here in our colony. And the king says, well, we'll see about that. So the king now sends the British Army under the command of the legendary Edward Braddock over to the New World, over here to the colonies. So now here in the colonies is not only the French army, but now the British army is going to be here as well. See how this is going to be shaping up into a war, right? Edward Braddock is a living legend in England. He is a good general. Definition of a good general, he wins battles. All right, his men are disciplined, they're well trained, they're experienced, they don't lose. All right, he's a legend and so is his group of soldiers. So now they're over here in the colonies. But I gotta tell you something about Edward Braddock. He and his men are used to fighting battles like they fight in Europe. See, in Europe, little time out here, in Europe back in those days, the way they would fight wars and fight battles is they did it in a civilized way. They fought like gentlemen. The way they did it is one side would get in their nice bright colored uniforms and tight formation shoulder to shoulder on one side of an open battlefield. And the enemy would line up the same way on the other side of the open battlefield. Kind of like a football game, right? And then ready, aim, fire, charge, retreat, whatever, one side would win and control the battlefield, and that's how they did it in Europe. And Braddock's always won. But now he's in the colonies. He's not in Europe, is he? And his orders are go to Fort Duquesne and take that fort from France. And to help show him the way, George Washington goes along with some of the Virginia Rangers. So we have General Braddock and the British Army, George Washington and the Virginia Rangers together marching across the wilderness to go remove the French from Fort Duquesne. Excuse me. Now, Braddock kind of takes George Washington under his wing. George Washington looks up to Braddock. He respects him. After all, he's the experienced general. All right, George Washington is just a farmer with a gun. All right, so along the way, George Washington is noticing, though, that the way they're traveling is they're all in tight formation, wearing their bright red coats, part of the British military uniform, and they're making a whole lot of noise. Since they're bringing cannons and everything, they gotta clear paths and build bridges across streams and rivers, so they're cutting down trees. All right, they also travel with a marching band, part of their army. Guys playing the fife and drums, those little flutes, beating on the drum, to kind of keep the spirits of the men up as they march. They're making a lot of noise. We got marching bands, we got timber, trees falling down, guys in bright red coats, all tightly packed together. George Washington finally talks to Braddock and says, hey, we're getting kind of close to Fort Duquesne. Maybe we ought to like spread out a little bit, get rid of these red coats, quiet down some. Braddock's like, nonsense. I know how to fight a battle. My men are disciplined. Just show me the way to Fort Duquesne. Okay. Well, as they get closer, shots fired. One British soldiers get bumped in the head. Another one's shot in the throat. Another one's hit in the leg. Shots coming from where? Well, one guy says from over here. Another soldier says no, they're from over here. Well, guess what? They're both right. There's shots being fired from both sides by the Indians. Hey, are the Indians going to line up across an open battlefield like in Europe? No, Indians don't fight that way. Indians are going to hide behind trees and rocks, and the British Army's now under an ambush. The battle for Fort Duquesne is on, and it's not going well for Braddock and the British Army. And pretty soon, Braddock himself is hit. He's gut shot. Page 75, there's a picture. Now, he doesn't die on the spot, but he is now going to survive this wound. He will eventually die from it. So he gives command to young George Washington. Now, George Washington is in charge not just of his Virginia Rangers, but the British Army. All right, so he takes control. He is a leader. Takes decisive action. He doesn't say, well, I told you so, and blame Braddock. No, leaders don't do that. Leaders just deal with the problem. So he got on a horse, rode out in the middle of the chaos, and starts giving orders to the British soldiers, and they're obeying him. Even though he's just a farmer with a gun, they recognize he's the man with a plan. He's in charge, so they want to survive, so they're listening to him, and he's giving them orders so that they can have an orderly retreat. Retreat means you're gonna lose the battle, the enemy's gonna be in control of the battlefield, but at least you can save your army from complete destruction so you can live again to fight another day. Because if there's no organization and everybody just scatters, well, every single soldier's gonna be either killed or captured. So George Washington's out giving orders, and his horse gets hit and shot out from under him. So he finds another horse, gets on that horse. That horse gets hit, shot out from under him. So he finds a third horse, and he's successful. He organizes a successful retreat. They lose the battle, but he salvages the army. Later that night, as George Washington's by his campfire, he's taking off his coat, and he notices, man, there's bullet holes all through his coat. Doggone it, I like this coat I just got. It's one of my favorite ones. Then he realizes, wow, I had a close call today, right? There's not a scratch on him. His coat's shot full of holes. He had 2 horses shot out from under him. He fell through the ice, survived the blizzard, survived an assassination attempt, all within the last several months. Is George Washington lucky? No, this is God's providence, right? God's hand of protection, because God has a plan for George Washington's life. Now, one of the reasons I like teaching history is not only can we learn as a nation from what happened in history, but we can take personal lessons from what happened in history as well. And here's an opportunity. It's not just George Washington. God has a plan for your life. He has a plan for my life. God has a plan for everybody's life. When I was your age, I didn't know what God's plan was. Not yet. But he revealed it to me little by little. Our job was just walk with him, read his word like we talked about the other day, obey his word, and eventually, in his right timing, he'll reveal what his plan is. If you would have told me when I was your age what God's plan was for my life, I'd have thought, no, you're wrong. I'd have laughed at you if you'd have told me I was going to be a teacher. There is no way. First of all, I hated school. Second of all, I'm gonna let you in on a secret. I failed one class in my whole life. I got one F on a report card. It was in high school, and it was speech class. The reason I got an F in speech class, I was too shy and afraid to stand up in front of my class and give a speech. So I took the F instead of giving a speech. Does that sound like a kid whose God's plan is to be a teacher someday? Now look at me, you can't shut me up, right? All I do is stand up in front of the class and talk. It just goes to show you, God has a plan. Might not be what you think it is. Well, God had a plan for George Washington, right? He's gonna be the father of our country. He can't be dying out here for Duquesne, so he survived that. Now, we'll get back to the war, but years later, fast forward 30-something, whatever years later, George Washington is president of the United States. He's an old guy, right? And he travels back to the site of that battle, which by that time was Fort Pitt, had been renamed Fort Pitt. And he met with some old gray-haired Indians, some old Indian warriors, the same guys he was fighting against all those years before. And they wanted to meet him. They said, hey, we were there. We realized that you were the leader. So we were all aiming at you, all our best sharpshooters. Because we knew if we could kill you, we would be able to take the entire army. We tried our best, and we don't miss, but we could not kill you. So we just wanted to see this great leader that the white man's God protected. Now they didn't understand the God of the Bible. They just knew, even his enemies knew, that the only explanation for him surviving that battle was there was a God protecting him. All right, back to the war. Eventually, wasn't that day, but eventually, the British Army recaptured Fort Duquesne, and then they renamed it Fort Pitt. Kind of explains why it's called Pittsburgh today. And let's fast forward all the way to the end of the war, which would be what year?
1763.
1763. War's been going on all those years. The final battle is outside the settlement of Quebec. Now, Quebec on my map, whoop, all the way up here at the top in what's today Canada. That's the final battle of the French and Indian War. And George Washington's not there. It's the British Army against the French Army. Outside in an open field, they do a good old-fashioned European-style battle. And the British Army wins. French Army loses. And that's the end of the French and Indian War. So the result of the war, remember what they were fighting over, was that land between the Appalachian Mountains and the Mississippi River. So everybody, look closely at your map on page 78. Page 78. What's it say about the green?
Taken from France by Britain in 1763.
Taken from France by Britain, 1763, the end of the French and Indian War. So in other words, all that land that they were fighting over, that would be west of the Appalachian Mountains, east of the Mississippi River. What country is it? What's your map say? What country is it? Everything in the green.
Britain.
It's Britain. Part of England. And not just England saying it anymore. Now France is agreeing. Why is it England? Because England won the French and Indian War. And that's how we determine who gets that land. Any questions on the French and Indian War? Going to be important starting next week. We're going to start learning lessons. Look at our map now. England goes all the way from the coast, past the Appalachian Mountains, all the way out to the Mississippi River. Almost half of a continent from the Mississippi River east is all part of the Kingdom of England as of 1763. Any questions?